Hi, I'm Jilly G. Welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how to make my gluten-free chocolate cheesecake. And for the crust, these are some of my chocolate sandwich cookies. Although they're not in a sandwich. They don't have any buttercream in the middle. But this cookie recipe is perfect for a chocolate crust for this cheesecake, or if you have another pie that you like to have a chocolate crust for. And I think I mentioned when I made these cookies that a lot of times I'll do a double batch and just freeze them for recipes like this. This recipe really comes together so fast and so easy. But like with any cheesecake, you want to make sure to make it the day before so it has all night to sit in the fridge before you serve it. You could make this recipe very first thing in the morning, and then you could serve it that evening if you have a dinner party or something like that. But it really needs at least 4 hours, overnight is best, in the fridge before serving. So what I'm doing first is I've got 4 ounces of semi-sweet chocolate baking squares. And I'm just cutting them up. It makes them melt a little bit faster. Cutting up chocolate is always so messy. And you could melt this in a saucepan, but the microwave is fast and easy. If for some reason you can't get or you can't find the chocolate baking squares, in a pinch you could use semi-sweet chocolate chips. It may or may not change the texture of your cheesecake, but it would work in a pinch. So what we're going to do first is make the crust. I've also got my oven preheating to 325. And if you don't have a food processor, you could just crumble these up in a plastic bag. But I'm going to melt my 4 tablespoons of butter, 1/4 cup of butter. And we need about 25 or so cookies, depending on the size that they are. But we need 2½ cups of crumbs. And I always break them up a little bit before I put them in the food processor, just to give it a head start. And even though my chocolate cookies don't have any filling in them, you could use cookies, if you buy store-bought gluten-free chocolate sandwich cookies, you would just process them with the filling. It doesn't matter if it's in there or not. With homemade ones, the buttercream is usually a little bit softer, and so it will make your crumbs not crumble up as good in the food processor. That was the most perfect melting of butter. It didn't explode. It's always a plus. This probably isn't enough, but we'll see how much we've got. So that was 1½. So now we just need 1 more cup of crumbs. And this might even be a little bit too much, but that is just fine. And I always just make sure they're in fine crumbs, which they look really good. And I just have a 9-inch Springform pan. You could make this recipe in a 9-inch pie dish. It doesn't have to be a Springform pan. It works just fine in either pie dish. And you could even do it in a 9-inch square dish and just make it into cheesecake bars. The only problem I've ever had doing that is it really doesn't seem to set up very much in the middle. So be wary of that. And then I just have a glass that we're going to press our crust into the pie dish. My oven is ready. And then I've got my melted butter, 1/4 cup of melted butter. And we'll just pour it on our crumbs. And you want to give it a really good stir. Make sure that butter gets on all of those crumbs. And you want it to look like wet sand. It's kind of hard to tell because the cookie crumbs are so dark. And then just lightly press it down and see how well it sticks together. And it's looking really good. And then all we do is just pour it into our pie dish or Springform pan. Level it out a little bit and then just start pressing it in. You could go up the sides a little bit if you want to, but I usually just make an even layer along the bottom. So now that our crust is ready, I'm going to set that aside, clean up a little bit, and we'll get to the filling. I'm using my same spatula. Want to just very carefully melt your chocolate. I should have gotten a bigger bowl, but it'll be all right. And I have a foil-lined cookie sheet to put my cheesecake on. It won't come up over the top, but Springform pans always seem to get a little bit weepy, and they get kind of greasy and the butter kind of weeps out when you're baking them. So I always put it on a cookie sheet. And you can see how my chocolate is melting all around the sides, but it's really chunky in the middle here. A good rule of thumb when you're melting chocolate is never go until it's all the way melted. You want it to be really chunky, just like this. And then the more you stir it, that residual heat will help melt the rest of the chocolate. It's better to go under melted than burn it and then you've scorched your chocolate. And you can see that's really melting all of those big chunks in there. Okay, that looks really good. I'm going to set that aside. And really not very many ingredients for the rest of the cheesecake. My measuring cup lost its handle a while ago. And you really want everything at room temperature. I know I say that for a lot of recipes, but for cheesecakes in particular, you really want your ingredients at room temperature so your cream cheese isn't lumpy. So 8 ounces of softened cream cheese, and we're just going to beat it with a hand mixer till it's a little bit smooth. So once you've got your cream cheese mixed up a little bit, clean it out of our beaters here a little bit. 1/4 cup of honey, really not very much at all. If you're using sugar, it would just be a 1/2 cup of sugar. It's one thing I really like about cheesecakes. They don't have very much sugar in them at all. So now give your cream cheese and your honey a really good mix. Scrape down your bowl. And I have 2 eggs. We're going to go one at a time. Now for our second egg. I am going to scrape off my beaters. You'll notice sometimes there's chunky cream cheese at the top, and you don't want that to come off and make your cheesecake lumpy. Now for our 1/2 cup of sour cream and 1 teaspoon of vanilla. And give this a really good mix. And for this cheesecake, we're not trying to whip a lot of air into it. You want it to be really combined, but you're not trying to create a lot of volume. And then I just make sure there's no lumps anywhere. Let me scrape off my spatula here. So let's check on our chocolate here. And it's really, really smooth. And our chocolate, the reason we melted it first is you want it to stay liquid, or you want it to stay pourable, but you don't want it to be hot. It will curdle your mixture in here, but you also want all of this mixture to be at room temperature, so when we pour this in, it combines really well. If you've ever added warmish chocolate to something cold, it will solidify and make chunks of chocolate in your mixture. Which you could do that if you really wanted it to be a chunky chocolate chip kind of cheesecake. And I'm just giving it a really good stir. And with our mixer on low speed, I'm going to start pouring in my chocolate. Except when you have to scrape out your bowl. Mix this until it's really combined, but on medium speed so we don't beat in a lot of air. Scrape down your bowl. Cheesecakes are so fast and easy to come together. They just take a while to bake sometimes, and then of course their chill time in the fridge overnight. But they're really easy and simple and fast. So bring back our crust. And we'll just pour this in. I'll get to this other ingredient in just a minute. You'll notice that the batter is a little bit on the thin side, which is just fine. You can pop these bubbles in here if you want to, but you don't have to. If you started using honey to make your desserts and other things, you'll notice that it does change the texture just a little bit. If you were to use regular white sugar, your batter would be a little bit thicker at this point. But don't worry, I think honey actually makes for a creamier cheesecake. So the cheesecake will go in the oven for about 35 to 45 minutes. Again, at 325. You'll want to check it at 35 minutes and see what's happening. You want it to be puffed and just set in the center. But once it's just set in the center, we'll take it out and put on our topping. And all this is 1 cup of sour cream and 1 tablespoon of honey. And I just give it a really good stir. And again, you want this at room temperature too. And even if you don't like sour cream, try this topping on your cheesecake. There's a few people that I know that don't like sour cream at all, but they really like it in desserts and of course other meals that you put sour cream in. So don't be nervous to try it. So just set this aside until we're ready to put it on our cheesecake. I don't know if you can see that or not. It's just barely jiggling in the middle. But the edges are kind of puffed up, and this is what you want. I'm going to let it cool off for about 5 minutes, and then I'll pour on my topping. Give our sour cream and honey a good stir. And I don't know if you noticed, but some of those little bubbles I didn't pop are showing up. But that's okay because we're going to put our topping on. And the reason I let it cool off for about 5 minutes is just to give it a chance to settle down a little bit before we pour the topping on. And if you were to take your cheesecake out of the oven too soon and your center wasn't as set as it needs to be for the topping, your topping will just sink to the bottom or sink to the middle. It won't go all the way to the bottom, which has happened before, and it will still taste delicious if that does happen. So what I do is I'll start around the outer edges and then just very carefully spread my topping on. And you notice how I'm not pouring any in the middle. And then just very carefully, and you don't need to go all the way to the edges, but just very carefully spread this topping out. And you want it to be kind of a nice design because it will show. So back into the oven for 10 more minutes. All right, now we just have to wait for it to cool off to room temperature. I'll wrap the whole thing in plastic wrap and stick it in the fridge overnight. Here we are tomorrow. I always put it on an extra plate because the bottom gets a little bit greasy sometimes. Very carefully lift it out of the ring. First one's always a little bit tricky. It's holding a slice really well. Let's turn this around so you can see. It's not a really tall cheesecake, but it's really rich. You don't want it to be really tall, but it's such a good chocolate cheesecake. If you like chocolate cheesecake, this is the one for you. And this chocolate crust really just adds that extra chocolatey flavor. And as I mentioned earlier, even if you don't like sour cream, this topping with the sour cream, it really helps to cut the super chocolatey filling here in the middle. But it's really just the perfect combination of chocolate. So good. I don't have my cookbook. Here it is. You've seen a lot of it lately, but this recipe is in my cookbook. This is such a great dessert for any time. Whether it's a fancy party or just a regular Sunday dinner, it's a really good dessert. Thank you to everybody that has been buying my cookbook. Thank you to everybody that is sharing my videos, sharing that you bought my cookbook. I love hearing that you guys are enjoying my cookbook. I can't say thank you enough. Maybe you'll try this recipe next. But thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you on the next one.